Close your eyes and build it. The city of 1,000,000 people, the largest human settlement the Western world had ever produced. Marble temples catching the morning light. Aqueducts carrying clean water across 40 miles of countryside into the heart of a civilization that had decided it deserved everything the earth could provide. The roar of the Colosseum on a festival day, 100,000 voices rising into the Roman sky. Legions on every frontier, holding the edges of a world that stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the deserts of Mesopotamia. The smell of bread and garum and incense and the particular metallic heat of a city that never fully slept. At the height of its power, the greatest engine of human ambition ever assembled. And at the very center of that engine, elevated above every senator, every general, every priest, sat the emperor. A man for whom the word power had ceased to have any practical upper limit. A man who could, on a morning's whim, alter the fate of provinces, the lives of thousands, the direction of history itself. A man who wanted for nothing the material world could offer. But material wealth, once total, stops being interesting. And so the appetites of the most powerful men in human history turned to something else. Something more personal. Something that required not conquest but possession of a different and more intimate kind. They turned to beauty, to youth, to the obsessive, depraved hunger for both that would leave a trail of ruined lives through the historical record, lives documented in the letters of Seneca, the histories of Suetonius, the poems of Martial, the legal codes of a civilization that was simultaneously sophisticated enough to build the Pantheon and brutal enough to treat a beautiful boy as a commodity to be purchased, altered, and consumed. In the gilded corridors of the Palatine Hill, behind the public theater of Roman imperial power, a different kind of theater was being staged. One whose performers had not auditioned willingly. One whose costumes, once put on, could never fully be removed. The forbidden archives are open. Rome was obsessed with beauty the way it was obsessed with everything, completely, systematically, and without meaningful restraint. The ideal that the Roman elite pursued was specific, youth itself frozen. The smooth face, the unformed quality of adolescence, the particular physical vulnerability that comes before a body settles into adulthood. This was not merely an aesthetic preference. It was a hunger. And like all hungers experienced by men who had never once been told no, it metastasized over time into something that demanded increasingly extreme satisfaction. The Roman practice of altering young men to preserve the qualities of youth was documented widely enough that it barely registered as scandalous to the historians who recorded it. It was simply a feature of the world, one of those facts about Roman life that sits in the ancient texts with the same matter-of-fact tone used to describe the price of grain or the outcome of a chariot race. Wealthy men of the senatorial and equestrian classes maintained households that included boys and young men selected specifically for their appearance, subjected to permanent physical alteration designed to prevent the natural progression of the body, kept in a state of arrested development that served their owners' appetites while destroying their own futures. The psychological dimensions of this horror are almost impossible to fully process from the distance of 2,000 years. Imagine being a boy in the Roman world, poor or enslaved, or simply unlucky enough to have been born with a face that caught the wrong person's attention at the wrong moment. One day you are a child with a future, undefined, perhaps difficult, but yours. The next, a decision has been made about your body by someone whose power over you is absolute and whose desire for you is a sentence from which there is no appeal. The alteration is performed. The future you would have had, the full life of a man in Roman society, with all its possibilities and dignities, is gone. Not metaphorically, permanently, physically, irrevocably. What was taken from these boys was not simply their bodies. It was the entire architecture of a human future. The possibility of a family, of growing into a man on their own terms, of becoming something other than what a powerful stranger's obsession had decided they should be. Seneca wrote about it with discomfort. Martial wrote about it with the casual wit of a man describing something unpleasant but unremarkable. The jurist Gaius recorded the legal frameworks that surrounded it. The practice existed at every level of Roman society, from the grandest imperial household to the homes of provincial merchants who had enough wealth to indulge the same appetites on a smaller scale. Rome built magnificent things. And it built them on a foundation that included this: the quiet, systematic consumption of boys whose beauty had made them visible to men who could afford to take anything they found beautiful. But of all the stories preserved in the forbidden archives of Rome, there is one that stands so far outside the boundaries of what power should be permitted to do to a human life that it has haunted historians for 2 millennia. This is the story of a boy called Sporus, and of the emperor who decided that grief gave him the right to unmake a person entirely. In the year 65 AD, Nero, already several years into a reign that was distinguished by paranoia, extravagance, and a complete detachment from the normal constraints of human behavior, murdered his wife Poppaea Sabina. The accounts differ on whether it was deliberate or a moment of rage, but the result was the same. The woman he had claimed to love was gone, and Nero, in the particular way of men who have never developed the internal resources to process loss, could not bear the absence she left. So he decided to replace her. Among the members of his household, Nero found a boy, a slave or freedman, young, of modest origins, whose face bore a resemblance to Poppaea that Nero found, in his unraveling state, to be sufficient. The boy's name was Sporus. What followed is recorded in Suetonius, in Cassius Dio, in the letters and histories that survived the centuries precisely because the events they described were extraordinary even by the standards of imperial Rome. Nero had Sporus permanently altered, subjected to the same unspeakable physical transformation inflicted on the favorites of the Roman elite, designed to arrest the development of his body and preserve the qualities that Nero found useful. Then Nero dressed him in the robes of an empress. He gave him Poppaea's name. He staged a formal wedding ceremony, complete with the rituals and witnesses of a legitimate Roman marriage, in which Sporus played the role of bride. And then he paraded him through the streets of Rome, through the markets of Greece during Nero's famous tour of that province, through the public spaces of the most powerful civilization on earth, with Sporus dressed in imperial women's clothing, expected to fulfill the role of Empress, addressed by the dead woman's name, wearing the dead woman's jewelry, performing the dead woman's life while the emperor walked beside him and the world watched. Suetonius, rarely a man given to moral commentary, noted dryly that people joked it would have been better for humanity if Nero's father had married that kind of wife. The joke lands because it acknowledges the enormity of what is happening even while deflecting from it, the Roman literary tradition's characteristic method of processing things it cannot directly confront. What was Sporus in any of this? What did he feel, walking through a Greek market in an empress's robes, called by a dead woman's name, the object of a powerful man's grief-maddened obsession? The historical record does not ask. The historical record almost never asks. He is described, noted, and moved past, a detail in the story of Nero's descent rather than the subject of his own story. That silence is its own kind of horror. After Nero's death, Sporus passed, because that is the verb that applies to him, the verb of an object rather than a person, to other powerful men. Nymphidius Sabinus attempted to claim him. The Emperor Otho took him as a companion. He is last recorded in the reign of Vitellius, where it is said he chose death rather than be forced to perform in a public spectacle that enacted the very myth of violation he had been living since Nero first saw his face. Even in choosing his own death, Sporus had to assert his humanity against a world that had systematically denied it from the moment his appearance made him useful to the wrong man. And here is where the Roman system reveals its most breathtaking hypocrisy. Because everything described so far, the alteration, the possession, the obsessive consumption of youth, was perpetrated by men who faced no legal consequences whatsoever. The senators, the equestrians, the emperors themselves, who drove and funded and demanded this entire apparatus of human consumption, the Roman legal system looked at them and saw citizens in full standing, men of dignity and status, pillars of the civilization. It looked at their victims and saw something else entirely. The concept of infamia, legal infamy, formal disgrace, was one of the Roman legal system's most precise instruments of social control. And it was applied, with a consistency that should take your breath away, not to the men who purchased and altered and kept human beings for their pleasure, but to the human beings who had been purchased, altered, and kept. A boy who had been subjected to these practices, regardless of whether he had any choice in the matter, regardless of whether he had been enslaved since childhood, regardless of whether the alteration had been performed on him before he was old enough to understand what was happening, was legally marked, degraded, stripped of the full rights of Roman citizenship, barred from giving testimony in court, excluded from the civic and legal protections that Roman society theoretically extended to free men. The law did not ask how he had come to be in this position. It did not inquire into the power differential between a boy and the Emperor of Rome. It simply noted what he was, as defined by what had been done to him, and adjusted his legal standing accordingly. The Roman elite had constructed a system with elegant, terrible efficiency. The men who created the demand faced no consequences. The boys and young men who were consumed by that demand were legally punished for having been consumed. The perpetrator was protected. The victim was marked. This was not an accident or an oversight in Roman law. It was the system working exactly as the people who designed it intended. Infamia existed to maintain the hierarchies that Roman society depended on, and in that hierarchy, the dignity of a wealthy man's appetites ranked considerably higher than the dignity of a poor boy's body. Cicero thundered about virtue. Augustus passed laws regulating morality. The Romans built temples to justice and carved her image in marble throughout the empire. And they built infamia into their legal code and called it civilization. Youth does not last. This is the biological fact that no amount of wealth or power or surgical intervention has ever successfully repealed. And so the question that the Roman system generated with the same mechanical inevitability as any other industrial process was this: what happens to a favorite when he is no longer favored? The answer, documented in the margins of Roman historical and literary sources, is grim enough to stand alongside any of the more theatrical horrors the ancient world produced. The men who had been kept in wealthy households, altered, possessed, displayed, aged out of the specific quality that had made them valuable. A boy who had been purchased at 12 for his remarkable face was, at 25, simply a man. A man with no marketable skills, no family connections that hadn't been severed, no legal standing that hadn't been compromised by infamia, no savings, no future that any of his previous circumstances had prepared him for. Some remained in households in diminished capacities, servants now rather than favorites, witnesses to their own replacement as younger boys were acquired to fill the roles they could no longer perform. Some were freed and found themselves cast into a Roman society that had marked them legally and socially in ways that made legitimate integration nearly impossible. Some descended through the layers of Roman urban poverty with a speed that the sources occasionally note and never dwell on. The historical record treats their fates as afterthoughts, which is precisely what Roman society treated them as. The spotlight that had briefly made them visible, the terrible visibility of being found beautiful by a powerful man, moved on to illuminate someone younger, and they stepped back into the darkness that Rome reserved for people it had used up. Sporus chose death over further spectacle. In doing so, he made the only unambiguous choice of his own that his entire life had permitted him. Most of the others made no choice that history recorded. They simply disappeared. And that disappearance, quiet, unremarkable, absorbed into the vast anonymous suffering of the ancient world, is perhaps the final and most complete expression of what Rome truly was beneath the marble and the rhetoric and the magnificent engineering. Not just a civilization capable of brutality in its arenas, where the violence was public and acknowledged and even celebrated, but a civilization capable of a quieter, more intimate brutality, conducted in private rooms, justified by law, and erased from the official record by the simple mechanism of never having considered its victims important enough to remember. Rome's greatest cruelty was not always the spectacle. Sometimes it was the silence afterward. History does not bury its horrors because they are unimportant. It buries them because they are mirrors, and the reflection never quite goes away. This has been the Forbidden Archives. The files are never truly closed.